Where's that? Where's that? Thank you.
Venerable Ananda Metteyya, whose lay name was Alan Bennett, stood in this space to open Maitreya Hall on the 25th of April, 1903. He'd been ordained just under a year. His higher ordination had been on the 12th of May, 1902 in Akyat, which is now Sitwe in Myanmar. His passage had been paid by J.E. Richard Pereira and his family, who was, of course, the father of Cassius Pereira, one of the co-founders of Servants of the Buddha. And J.E. Richard Pereira had pioneered this hall, Maitreya Hall. Venerable Ananda Metteyya spoke on Western education for Buddhist bhikshus. Here's a picture of him taken in Sri Lanka in 1903. He appears as a very young bhikkhu, his head, not completely shaved, but he was an ordained bhikkhu. So his address, well, there was certainly diffidence because the people there, the members of the Mahasangha, included the Buddhist revivalists who were very famous in Sri Lanka at that time. For instance, Venerable Sumangala. So he said at the beginning of his talk, "There is not one here this day, clad in the yellow robe, who is not my superior, alike in knowledge of the law and in seniority in the Sangha." He then went on to say that he'd agreed to speak because of the aim of the hall. Maitreya Hall aimed to give instruction in English on Buddhism and Western learning to bhikkhus and also lay people. And Ananda Metteyya embodied these two elements, Buddhism and the West. So this is why he'd agreed to speak to such an auspicious gathering. And his address was an impassioned plea for Sri Lankan bhikkhus to learn English and engage with Western science to defend and promote Buddhism in the world of British imperialism. And he also mentioned the threat of Christian missionary activity. Christian missionaries were attempting to undermine Buddhism in order to draw Buddhists away from their religion. So this is one quote from the address. "What is most needed today in Ceylon is a body of priests capable of explaining the law from the Western standpoint, of illustrating it by modern similes, capable of holding their own in a controversy, capable of meeting the rising generation of Sinhalese on their own level from their newer standpoint, and not from the standpoint of 1,000 years ago. And if Buddhism is to hold its own in Lanka, you must create a body of priests, in other words, bhikkhus, that are full of energy and zeal to preserve the faith, willing to work, and above all, able to preach the law, the Buddhist law, to men of Western education, without showing themselves ignorant of the facts known to every schoolboy in an English school." So he was encouraging education for bhikkhus that would enable them to engage with the modern world, to engage with modern scientific discoveries and all that that was bringing to the West, and which was also being taught in the schools, particularly Christian schools. And it was a message that was very much needed in that imperial context. Of course, Cassius Pereira would have been there. Cassius Pereira was a friend of Ananda Metteyya right throughout his life. And Alec Robertson told me in this hall, it must have been in the early 1990s, that the two of them could almost read each other's minds. So they had a telepathic kind of communication and certainly a very deep friendship. So Ananda Metteyya's importance for me, well, it's certainly a privilege to be standing in the place where Maitreya Hall was opened. And as Manuri has said, my first encounter with Ananda Metteyya goes back to when I was doing my doctorate in Sri Lanka. I was sitting in the Buddhist Publication Society and discovered a book of Ananda Metteyya's articles. And I was absolutely captured by them. Here was someone I realized who loved Buddhism, who was positive about it, and this was a marked contrast with some of the negative representations of Buddhism that I was reading for my doctorate, which was on the British encounter with Buddhism in 19th century Sri Lanka. And in my doctorate, Ananda Metteyya was present at the very end as a British figure who straddled over the 19th century and also the 20th century. Then after my doctorate was completed in 1993, I wrote a booklet on Ananda Metteyya for the Buddhist Publication Society, and I believe that's still available on the website of the Buddhist Publication Society. And then 6 years ago, I began writing a much more detailed biography of Ananda Metteyya, together with an American academic, John Lowell Crowe. John Crowe was an expert on the earlier part of Ananda Metteyya's life, when he was exploring different aspects of spirituality. My own research into his life involved fieldwork in Sri Lanka and Myanmar, working with research assistants so I could get material in Burmese and Sinhala. That biography was submitted only at the end of 2023. It'll be published in 2025 by Equinox Publishing, and it'll be 2 volumes. The biography will form the first volume, and then a selected collection of his writings, the second volume. So this presentation draws from just part of the biography. And that stresses what so attracted Alan Bennett to Buddhism, that he was willing to give his whole life to propagating. I'm first going to sketch the religious context in Britain that gave rise to an interest in Buddhism, because conversions never arise in a vacuum. They always arise in a particular context. Then I'll move to Bennett's context. What were the factors that drew him, with his life story and his background, towards Buddhism? And then I'll move to, within this context, what were the aspects of Buddhism that attracted him and why? Then lastly, I want to reflect on what message Ananda Metteyya may have for us today in terms of how Buddhism, and indeed how any other religion, should be lived. So the 19th century British context. Well, empire and Orientalism is the first kind of strand, because the British attempted to rule Ceylon and Myanmar, or colonial Ceylon and colonial Burma. Accounts of Buddhism traveled to Britain from civil servants, from soldiers, from casual visitors, from missionaries. Some were positive, some were negative. The missionary representation of Buddhism was particularly negative. Some were what I would call fantastical, presenting Buddhism as exotic, as esoteric, as colourful, and some were textual. In Sri Lanka, there was a Wesleyan Methodist missionary called Daniel Gogarly, who was translating the Pali text into English in the 1830s. But these didn't reach the West, or at least not until much later. He published in a Wesleyan Methodist magazine called The Friend, and also in the journal of the Ceylon branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. In the West, the founding of the Pali Text Society in 1881 by T.W. Rhys-Davids was a key point in terms of bringing the texts of Buddhism to the West. But also Max Muller's Sacred Books of the East series was important. Between 1879 and 1910, he published about 50 volumes, including some volumes on Buddhism. So on the one hand, empire and Orientalism, as Westerners tried to understand Buddhism through its texts and through its lived reality. On the other hand, scientific research and theory. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of the Species by Natural Selection. In other words, by evolution. And this challenged many Jews and Christians who had been used to the narratives present in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. And some lost their faith because of Charles Darwin's research. Others tried to reinterpret, and today Jews and Christians would not see the narratives in the book of Genesis as literally true. But some of those who were challenged by Darwin moved into free thought. Free thought movements arose in the 19th century, stressing reason, logic, not dogma and religious authority. So the free thinkers were generally anti-religion, anti-all religion, stressing reason and logic alone. But alongside these free thought movements were what I would call new religious movements, expressing a kind of search for spiritual alternatives. The Theosophical Society, founded in 1875 by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott, is perhaps the most well known. And you'll certainly know about the Theosophical Society. But there was also others, the Order of the Golden Dawn, for instance. Now, this particular order was different from Theosophy in that it practiced ceremonial magic. It believed in the occult, the esoteric, and initiated its members into kind of ritual practice of magic. And all this represented a kind of search in the 19th century for spiritual alternatives other than Christianity. So Alan Bennett and Ananda Metteyya. Now, the usual kind of Buddhist biography of Alan Bennett and Ananda Metteyya would say that, yes, he was born in December 1872 and he was born in London. At 18, he read The Light of Asia and converted. Then in early 1900, he arrived in Sri Lanka, where he learnt Pali and eventually gave a lecture in Colombo on the Four Noble Truths. But he then moved to colonial Burma, present-day Myanmar, and gained novice ordination in 1901 and Upasampada higher ordination in 1902. He remained in Burma until 1908, when he brought a 6-month mission to England, trying to convert, or at least encourage, Londoners and Britishers more widely to be interested in Buddhism. He then returned to Burma and disrobed in 1914 because for reasons of ill health, he was advised to go back to England and would have had to have used money on the journey back. And he died in 1923. The less well-known biography would appeal to the context that nurtured his interest in Buddhism. His mother was a Roman Catholic. And probably as a teenager, Bennett rejected his mother's Roman Catholic heritage. And one of the main reasons for this was that he simply could not believe in a God of love who seemed to condone so much suffering in the world. Even as a teenager, he looked at the world and saw suffering, including his own, because he suffered from asthma from the stage of childhood, and this became chronic as he grew older. He also suffered particular bereavements. He had fairly affluent grandparents, but they died when he was young. And then his mother died soon afterwards. We don't know much about his father, but poverty and hardship resulted. Later on, he would claim that secular knowledge also contributed to his rejection of Christianity and the Roman Catholicism of his childhood, his scientific interests, and things like that. As a teenager and into his 20s, he explored several religions. So the story that we sometimes get that he read The Light of Asia at the age of 18 and converted at that point is probably wrong. In his 20s, he explored a lot of spiritual paths. He joined the Theosophical Society in 1893, and we know that the Theosophists encouraged their members to investigate different religions. And we also know that Alan Bennett, as he then was, presented papers on Egyptian mythology, alchemy, astrology, and medieval magic at theosophical lodges. But he probably read his first Buddhist texts at this time, but also Hindu texts as well, because he was reading Hindu texts on meditation. And a friend recorded that at 18 years, he had an intense spiritual experience linked to Hindu meditation. He then moved from the Theosophical Society to the Order of the Golden Dawn and became known as quite a successful magician. So theosophy and the esoteric and even magic nurtured an interest in Ananda Metteyya, or Alan Bennett, he then was, in Buddhism. Also, his excitement with science. In the early stage of his life, he believed that scientific advance could change the world for the better. Later on, as I will show at the end of this talk, he became disillusioned about that and realized that science had to go together with moral advancement. But science and meditative experience led to an interest in the mind. And of course, this also resonated with what he learned about Buddhism. So suffering, loss of belief in God, excitement with science, and meditative experience were all important in his journey towards Buddhism. And this was combined with awareness of inhumanity in Britain. He would later compare the compassion that he found in Myanmar with the inhumanity he saw in Britain. The overflowing jails, the amount of poverty, the hardship. And this also attracted him to Asia. So what were the aspects of Buddhism that attracted him on the evidence of his writings? Well, I'm going to mention several streams quite briefly and then go back and look at them in more detail. So the first stream of aspects of Buddhism that attracted him were Buddhism's message on suffering and compassion. He found in Buddhism a credible answer to the suffering in life through the Four Noble Truths. He found that suffering was not caused by gods or demons, but by individualism, competition, and consumerism. And also in his journey into Buddhism, he saw that compassion was the only response to the world's suffering. I'm going to go back to that stream. Stream number 2, rationalism and the rule of law. As someone fascinated by science, the rule of law in Buddhism expressed in the principle of karma appealed to him. Of course, the principle of karma says that good action produces good fruits, bad action or unwholesome action produces unwholesome fruits. So for Ananda Metteyya, a cosmos infused with a moral law was particularly attractive. It invited trust that the cosmos was not arbitrary. It was not governed by the capriciousness of gods and demons, but by a moral law. Stream number 3, the Buddha as more than human. The self-sacrifice and personality of the Buddha really appealed to Ananda Metteyya, and it invited within him devotion and love. I'll say more about this later, but the Buddha was for him a being beyond the human, yet giving a role model for every human being. 4, Buddhism as capable of saving the West from disaster. Well, he was, when he was a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, interested in hidden knowledge, esotericism, but he rejected that when he became attracted to Buddhism and became a Buddhist monk. That the Buddhist message was understandable by everyone, whether they were Buddhist or not, appealed to him. And he believed that it was capable of challenging the inhumanity he saw, what I've mentioned before. Overcrowded jails, poverty, stockpiling of armaments. It was capable of bringing happiness rather than exploitation, anxiety, and pain. And when he first converted, he believed that the West had only to hear about Buddhism to be converted. That optimism was dented when he actually came to Britain and brought a mission to Britain. Not as many people converted as he hoped. He went back a little disappointed, I think. But nevertheless, he felt that Buddhism was capable of saving the West from itself, from disaster. So going back a little to stream 1, suffering and compassion. Now, I've mentioned the fact that he gave a lecture on the Four Noble Truths in Colombo in 1901 before he went to Myanmar to be ordained. And at this point in 1902, he explained the first noble truth in this way, or at least appealed to his audience in this way. And knowing that great truth of the oneness of all, not merely of all humanity, but of all holiest and meanest lives, have you learnt this? And can you say this day, I have no sorrow? No sorrow when the eyes of your brothers are filled with tears, when the whole face of fair-seeming nature is but the mask of an intolerable and a continuous cruelty. When the air vibrates with the cry of living, helpless things in pain, what woe greater than to feel apart from other life, to feel that one is against these other lives and for himself alone, to be without pity for the weak and sorrow for the sorrow of all. Here in this quote, you can see Bennett's awareness that suffering characterizes all life. Not just the life of the poor, not just the life of humans, but all life, all sentient lives. And that we are interlinked through this suffering. And Bennett's empathy for the suffering of all living beings can also be seen in this quote. And for him, the cause was egocentric longing or craving or clinging, right at the center of Buddhism, as we know. So he continued, we long for wealth, and having it not, we grieve. Or having it, we fear to lose. And this longing, this fear is sorrow's cause. We long for love, for happiness, for life itself, for all things fair and happy and beautiful upon earth. And this longing is sorrow's cause. For either we cannot have, or having, the inexorable hand of time must rend from us what we love. And so comes woe. So in order to approach this, to respond to this, renunciation of the idea of the self was needed, according to Ananda Metteyya. And the doctrine of non-self, anatta, permeates his writings. It divided him from the Theosophists, and he had some kind of conversations with the Theosophists on this. Theosophists spoke of the true self, the real self, the evolving self. Ananda Metteyya disagreed. He came to the view that the realization of anatta, the letting go of any care for self, was the key to the development of compassion and the creation of a better world. For him, it was almost the most important teaching of the Buddha, and demanded in all of us a radical letting go, a renunciation. And it is often what he stressed, particularly when he was speaking to Westerners. Non-self and compassion, because he leapt from that to the quality that's there at the heart of the Brahmaviharas. In Colombo in 1901, speaking about the Four Noble Truths, he set himself the task of summarizing Buddhism in one word and chose pity. 20 years later, in the 1920s, he wrote an article for the Buddhist Annual of Ceylon, and it was called The Religion of Compassion. And here he stressed this point even with greater emphasis. Compassion was the highest attribute of living creatures, even as it is the latest development of the human mind. The highest attribute of living creatures. Compassion for him was the only possible response to dukkha, to suffering, pain, and anguish. And it was though progression along the spiritual path of Buddhism, for him was progression in compassion. The compassion that was kind of grew from renunciation of the idea of self. So in 1910, Ananda Metteyya wrote quite a long article called The Religion of Burma, and it was for quite a prestigious publication, 20th Century Impressions of Burma, and it was linked with the British administration. And in this article, he appealed to his readers, and he, I think, imagined them to be Western readers, because 20th century impressions of Myanmar or Burma, as it then was geared towards the West. So he invited Westerns, enter then on this way of peace, enter it by self-restraint, by self-renunciation, live, work, strive, no more for self, but for pity of all life. So by reforming yourself, may you help to relieve the pain of all and bring your little wave of life to break at last upon the further shore of Nirvana, of course. So this first stream began with awareness of suffering, then to the link between suffering and self-centeredness or craving, to the realization that we are all connected, interlinked, then to the arising of compassion and relief of the pain of all, with the result being a better society. Stream 2, rationalism and rule of law. This in Myanmar. In other words, at the beginning of 1902, he sent to the Pereira family, to Richard Pereira and Cassius, an article that he called Animism and Law. And it was then published in the journal The Buddhist. In this article, he argued that monotheistic religions, those that believed in one God, were the highest form of animism because of their belief that events were caused by gods and demons. Now, the Muslims and Christians present today might disagree with this, but it was quite important in Ananda Metteyya's thought, because he contrasted this with the rule of law present in the discoveries of scientists and in Buddhism through the principle of karma, of action, as I've described before. And what appealed to him about this was that responsibility for what happens to our world lies not with gods, demons, or other celestial powers, but with humanity, and whether humanity acts through its greed or through its compassion. And pushing humanity a little bit more towards compassion, he believed, led to hope for humanity. Our point seems to have I don't know. My PowerPoint is stuck. Oh, yes, my note. I don't know. Might have to in this way. Good. It's just orbit. So stream 3, the Buddha as more than human. Now, at the time Ananda Metteyya lived, some Western Orientalists who wrote about Buddhism presented Buddhism as a philosophy, not a religion. Now, Ananda Metteyya critiqued this. He was very sensitive to lived Buddhism and the devotion of the people in Ceylon, colonial Ceylon and colonial Burma. In one talk he gave, he claimed that reading the texts of the Pali Canon, was like moonlight in a clear starlit sky. Now, moonlight in a clear starlit sky is very attractive. It can lift one to a higher plane. But he compared this with the sunlight of Buddhism. And the sunlight of Buddhism was Buddhism in Asia, the devotion of the people. He said that for him in Myanmar, in Burma, the very air seemed to pulse with devotion and with the love of the people for the Buddha. And this for him was the sunlight of Buddhism. And it was linked, this kind of appreciation was linked to a view of the Buddha that was different from some Orientalists and some of those who were writing about Buddhism and trying to say, well, the Buddha was just a man who gained enlightenment. So in 1901, quite early, in Colombo, speaking about the Four Noble Truths, he defended devotion to the Buddha in this way. So Buddhists showed devotion to the Buddha because he, the Buddha, left his palace and all that glorious life of his to go to the forest and seek truth, that we might find the way to peace. Because having found, for 45 long years, he preached the truth untiringly, that others too might find the holy way. because dying, he told us that he had not, like other teachers of his time and race, kept something back, but had declared all the truth to men because of all these things. But most of all, because he never spoke an angry or an unloving word, because he is to us beyond all comparison the personification of our highest ideal, which is pity, love, and compassion. Therefore do we adore him. Therefore do we worship him with flowers and lights and all beautiful things. Therefore, most of all, do we enshrine him as the supreme ideal in our hearts. And so our worship is the offering of love, and not a bazaar for the bartering of prayer and devotion for benefits from on high. So an offering of love without any hope of return except for the gift of the teaching. And then in 1923, in a lecture he gave in London towards the end of his life, he presented the Buddha as beyond humanity, as the focus of an incredibly strong power. Buddhahood consists not in his humanity, but rather in the fact that through lives of incredible effort and endurance, he has attained to a spiritual evolution which renders him as different from a human being as the sun is different from one of its servient planets, which makes of him his personality whilst it endures, his teaching after that personality has passed away, a focal center of spiritual power, no less mighty in its sphere than that of the sun in the material realm. Why Buddhology there? Stream 4, Buddhism is capable of saving the West from disaster. I've mentioned that he saw the advantages of Buddhism not being about the esoteric, of not being about hidden doctrines, not being about specialized rituals or anything magical. Buddhism was about easily understood truths, about forgetting self and practicing compassion in a world shot through with suffering, with dukkha. And he was passionate in his belief that if only the West could grasp this, it could be saved from itself, it could be saved from the arrogance of empire, it could be saved from war. Not even the label of Buddhism was necessary for this. So towards the end of his life, he felt that perhaps Buddhism should be communicated without the label Buddhism. Just the message of the Buddha should be communicated in order to help people turn their lives around and see the world in a different way, not through the eyes of self, but through the eyes of compassion and self-renunciation. I brought in Stream 5 because Ananda Metteyya wrote and spoke at a time when quite a few Westerners were saying that Nirvana in Sanskrit, was nihilistic, that it was the annihilation of everything, and therefore that Buddhism was pessimistic. And Ananda Metteyya completely challenged this. In 1903, from colonial Burma, he wrote an article on Nirvana for the journal that he'd started, Buddhism, and this is his kind of conclusion. And so to conclude, if I am asked, is the Nirvana annihilation? Is it cessation? Is it the end of all? I reply, thus even have we learned. It is annihilation. The annihilation of the threefold fatal fire of passion, wrath, and ignorance. It is annihilation. The annihilation of conditioned being, of all that has bound and fettered us. The cessation of the dire delusion of life that has veiled from us the splendor of the light beyond. It is the end of all, the end of the long, tortuous pilgrimage through worlds of interminable illusion, the end of sorrow, of impermanence, of self-deceit, from the torment of the sad dream of life and everlasting awakening, from the torture of selfhood and eternal liberation, a being, an existence, that to name life was sacrilege and to name death a lie, unnameable, unthinkable, yet even in this life to be realized and entered into. Thus is the glory of Nirvana by our Lord declared, and such the goal of this our Buddhist faith. So Ananda Metteyya there, I kind of putting into those words all of his hope and all of his conviction that Nirvana was unnameable, but absolute bliss, the highest to be reached. So what message does he have for us today about how Buddhism, or indeed other religions, should be lived? Well, I want to mention 5 things. Firstly, Ananda Metteyya stressed that it is the teaching of the Buddha rather than the label Buddhism that is most important. That if the principles of Buddhism could be communicated and that if people listened and acted and lived in that way, then that was enough. Secondly, he placed the Buddha in the center rather than institutions, rather than the power relationships of institutions and perhaps some of the tensions that arise within institutions. The teaching of the Buddha should be at the center, nothing else. Thirdly, that the message of the Buddha was not just about personal liberation. Yes, it was about personal liberation. That's evident from his description of Nirvana. But Buddhism was also about changing society. His was an engaged Buddhism before the term was used. Some of you may know that in the 20th century, some Buddhists chose to label themselves engaged Buddhists because they sought to kind of challenge some of the injustices of society, some of the hardships within society. That Buddhism, and they were stressing that Buddhism was about this as well as about meditation and personal progress along the spiritual path. Well, Ananda Metteyya was there before them, seeking a better society. And within this path towards a better society, he stressed that human responsibility was central. Not reliance on gods or demons, not believing that we are at the mercy of gods and the punishment of gods. No, compassion and love should be at the center, not fear of punishment or the capriciousness of a celestial being. And then lastly, he stressed the need for Buddhism to be able to speak to each new generation in new ways, Buddhism or any other religion. In this space of Maitreya Hall, he appealed to those present to realize that Buddhist monks had to engage with Western learning, with Western science, in order to communicate the truth of Buddhism. And the question for us now is, what does Buddhism need to engage with in the present in order to help the truths of Buddhism to be communicated to others? And in this, there was an indictment of Christianity, especially after World War I. He believed that Christianity had failed the West, that although Jesus was a good man, and although the ethics of Christianity were praiseworthy and should be followed, he believed that Christianity had failed. It had led to war. Speaking to the Buddhist Society in 1918, at the end of the war, when thousands of young people were still being killed on the plains of Flanders and in the trenches, he said that Christianity had failed to restrain the greed for world empire and that this had led to war. He continued, for stability, it is essential that every advance in the conquest over nature, in other words, scientific advancements, should be accompanied by an equal advance in the conquest over self, over the spirits of greed and passion and ambition, which have brought this late calamity upon our Western world. And I think this invites not only Buddhists, but those of all religions to look at themselves, to look deeply at whether they are living the principles that they believe in. So thank you. And I end with a picture of a young Ananda Metteyya in Myanmar, having set up what he called the International Buddhist Society with his Burmese sponsors around him. Thank you.
What am I?
Well,